So back to our presenters. Matthew Mendelsohn is the director of the Mowat Centre and is an associate professor at the School of Public Policy and Governance at U of T. He has served as Deputy Minister in the Ontario government and as a Senior Policy Advisor in the Privy Council Office in the federal government. He was a member of the Department of Political Studies at Queen's from 1994 to 2004. Our second presenter is Michael Powell, who holds degrees in political science from Queen's University and the University of Toronto, a law degree from U of T, and NYU Law School. He was called to the Bar of Ontario. It doesn't quite say when, but he's so young it must have been very recent. He's currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. His main areas of research are comparative election law, no wonder, which is why he's speaking about this today, and constitutional law. He has clerked at the Court of Appeal for Ontario and worked in the national law firm in Toronto, and he's a former board member of the South Asian Legal Aid Clinic of Ontario. Welcome to both of you. Over to Matthew Mendelsohn.
Thank you very much, Ratna. Thank you to Maytree, Ratna, Alejandra for organizing this and helping us connect with a big community. Michael and I are going to split this presentation. I'm going to do the first half, and Mike will do the second half. I just wanted to say by way of introduction that Mike, Sujit Chowdhury, who's not here, and myself, we began speaking about this issue 10 years ago when it became clear that those Canadians who lived in the most populous ridings were increasingly racialized minorities, new Canadians, and increasingly concentrated in the suburbs around Canada's largest cities. And we became convinced that this was a democratic problem, but also a constitutional one as well. And we, Mike and Sujit in particular, wrote papers on this and started to lobby for change quite a while ago. It's kind of a wonky issue, and for many people it seems a little bit technical, but at the end of the day, if people, racialized minorities, suburban Canadians, new Canadians, live in the most populous ridings, their vote counts for less, they have less say on who's going to form government, and the issues that they care about are going to be spoken about less in our national parliament. There have been changes recently that we're going to talk about, and we're at a key moment when Canadians have an opportunity to participate in this process and try and consolidate some of the progress that has been made on this important issue, which I think can help shape the political conversation over the next 10 years and will have an influence on who has power and who doesn't. So why are we talking about this issue? We are talking about it because some Canadians have less voting power and less influence on important national issues. As you can see there, someone who lives in the riding of Oak Ridges Markham has about half the voting power of the Canadian average. Obviously, that means that some Canadians will have more voting power. Likewise, people in Brampton West have about half the voting power of the average Canadian. That means it takes 2 votes in Brampton West compared to 1 vote for the Canadian average to elect a member of Parliament. And clearly that means that their votes and their power is going to be less than we would have in a true system of voter equality where all Canadians' votes count for the same. As I say, these large differences in the size of federal electoral districts mean many Canadians are underrepresented in the House of Commons. These Canadians are increasingly suburban and new Canadian. It matters now, and we're talking about it now, for a number of reasons. Perhaps the most important reason is that the federal boundary commissions are redrawing electoral districts to reflect changes in the population right now. Mike will talk a little bit more about where we are in the process and about how this happens every decade. But right now, in Canadian provinces, boundaries are being redrawn, new electoral maps are being created, and this is an opportunity to rectify and redress some of the voter inequality that exists. This is an opportunity for Canadians to really make a difference. The commissions in each province are currently seeking public input. Presenting at a public hearing has a real impact on the redistribution process. In previous redistributions, many ridings get changed after public consultations. So these public consultations with the independent boundary commissions in each province are not pro forma. They're real and they matter, and they can shape the electoral districts that will emerge when the final map gets released next year. So one of the things we're doing is encouraging people to present at commission hearings. This includes people who may not have thought about this issue before or have thought it was important, but given people have registered for this webinar and we got a lot of registrations, I think that it's clear that people are recognizing that the electoral map does matter and will influence how decisions are made over the next 10 years. When we talk about voter equality, we mean that all Canadians' votes are equal. This means that electoral districts should all have about the same number of voters. This principle is enshrined in the Canadian Constitution and is usually referred to as representation by population. We don't have voter equality in Canada for a lot of reasons right now. There are constitutional protections for the representation of smaller provinces. There are legislative protections for the representation of smaller provinces as well. There are also large permitted deviations between ridings within provinces. And the things that are going on right now are really profound demographic change. We have a relatively small, widely dispersed population in Canada, but very uneven population growth, with extreme population growth in some areas, Calgary-Edmonton corridor, the lower mainland of BC, the 905, the suburbs around Toronto, and very slow population growth elsewhere. And so the riding boundaries and the size of riding boundaries have a great deal of difficulty keeping up with these changes. But if we don't keep up with these changes, it means that Canadians living in these large ridings have less voting power. Many people ask us when we deal with this issue whether some deviation from voter equality is okay, and of course it is. And at the Mowat Centre, but Mike's work, we of course accept and recognize that there's going to be there's going to be deviation from the principle of equality. We already have very large existing deviations between different provinces, and Mike and I both believe that it's important to protect remote and northern communities. And in Canada, there are a small number of northern and remote communities that have very, very small populations for their ridings, and we recognize that that's inevitable given our geography and the difficulty of trying to represent very dispersed populations over wide expanses of northern territory. And this is common in many democracies, but right now we have too much deviation. That's both between provinces and within provinces. Our deviation right now is larger than in other countries, and it's larger than ever before in our history. So what we've been encouraging is a return to balance. We don't think that we're going to get perfect rep by pop or voter equality, but we've drifted too far in Canada from that principle, and we're trying to restore some of that balance. So right now we have deviations between provinces, and those are very difficult to deal with because they are constitutionally protected. So there's a large difference in the average riding size between provinces. So provinces like Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia, a riding has about 75,000 people. Province of Prince Edward Island, which has very small ridings, it's just over 30,000, but they only have 4 seats. In Ontario, Alberta, and BC, those provinces all have the largest ridings in the country, and they have about 105,000 people per riding, and that's the average per riding in those provinces. But there are also deviations within provinces. So federal electoral districts can deviate by plus or minus 25% from the provincial average. So if the provincial average is 105,000, it can be 25% above that or 25% below that. And this is what the Supreme Court has said. and in exceptional circumstances, as we've discussed, to account for northern or widely dispersed ridings, it can be even more than 25%. When we talk about vote weight, we're talking about an ideal vote weight of 1, which means that the value of one average Canadian voter equals the average of other Canadian voters. Voters in high population electoral districts have low vote weight. Their vote weight is less than 1. It takes more voters to elect a member of parliament. Voters in low population districts have high vote weight. It takes fewer voters in a riding in Prince Edward Island to elect a member of parliament, so at the end of the day their voice counts for more. In Canada's largest riding, Oak Ridge's Markham, a single member of parliament represents 228,000 Canadians right now, so a single vote is worth 0.47. Obviously, for many Canadians that would be a problem, and a lot of the reason for this is the high population growth that has been taking place in the suburbs around the Greater Toronto area. I'm going to turn this over to Mike now to walk us through some other issues.
Hi everyone, Mike here. So there has been some progress in terms of representation by population recently in Canada. In this past December 2011, the government passed Bill C-20, which is the Fair Representation Act, and that bill made some real positive moves forward in moving towards representation by population. So it changed the formula for calculating the number of seats each province is entitled to in the House of Commons, and it actually added more seats to the House of Commons. From 308, it added 30 to 338. So those 30 new seats will be allocated in the following way: 6 to British Columbia, 6 to Alberta, 15 to Ontario, and 3 more to Quebec. Now those seats are being added to those provinces because that's where population growth is concentrated in Canada, and that's a long-term demographic trend over a few decades where population growth is concentrated in the urban areas in BC, Alberta, and Ontario, and then to a slightly lesser extent in Quebec. So the boundary commissions that Matthew spoke about that are at work right now will allocate these new ridings as they're drawing the boundary line within the provinces. So as I said, C-20 is an important move forward, but there's still work that needs to be done. Under the formula adopted in C-20, the average riding size in Ontario, Alberta, and BC will still be quite a bit larger than in other provinces. So if you're a voter in one of those provinces, your vote will still be worth less than if you're a voter in the other provinces. Bill C-20 also does not ensure equal riding size within each province. So as Matthew said, ridings can deviate by 25% above or below the average riding size in that province. That's from the Electoral Boundary Readjustment Act. That rule has not changed. So there can still be quite large deviations within provinces, usually meaning urban and suburban voters will have their votes being diluted. And because that 25% deviation is still there, commissions, which will be engaging in public hearings, I'm going to talk about that a bit more, but those commissions get under significant pressure to use that permissible 25% deviation to overrepresent certain areas and underrepresent others. So the redrawing of federal electoral boundaries that's happening now, and the addition of the 30 new seats, is a really fantastic opportunity to help create electoral districts that stick closer to representation by population. So let me just describe the electoral boundary redistribution process a little bit. The electoral boundaries are redrawn in Canada every 10 years after the census. And using the 2011 census data, the commissions are currently underway doing that work. And now the boundaries are being redrawn to take into account these new districts in some of those provinces, then also to account for changes and movements in population. So how does it work? There are 10 independent electoral boundary commissions. So these are not stacked with partisan appointees. That's an important thing to know. These are non-partisan commissions, so one in each province. There are 3 members on each commission with the judge as a chairperson in each province, which helps ensure impartiality and independence. And these commissions draft new maps with the electoral districts, then consult with the public and members of Parliament, and then produce final maps which are adopted and which will be used for subsequent elections. So where are we in the redistribution timeline? So Bill C-20 reallocated seats in the House of Commons in December 2011. The relevant census data came out, and then the commissions were established as they had to be under statute. So what's happened now is most, but not all, of the commissions have put forward their draft proposals for how they think the electoral maps should be. So the next phase is quite extensive public hearings in each province where the commissions will host meetings in all regions of the province. So after they get input from the public, the commission the commission then hears objections from members of Parliament and then produces a final report, which is the one that eventually goes into effect. So commissions have released proposed maps in BC, Alberta, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland, and then we're still waiting on Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Prince Edward Island. And those maps should be coming out in the next few weeks or quite early in the fall. So just to talk about some of the proposals that have been put out already. So in British Columbia, the proposed map actually moves quite a bit closer to voter equality. There are 9 seats that deviate by more than 5% from perfect voter equality, and 1 seat that deviates by more than 10%. And so as I said, BC has 6 new seats in its electoral map. All but one of those is in the Lower Mainland. And why did that happen? That's because that's where population growth is concentrated. And one of the important things that the BC Commission did was to take into account where population growth is likely to happen. Population growth doesn't occur evenly. It occurs in specific areas of each province, usually in urban areas, and they try to take that into account to try to diminish the impact of growing population over the next 10 years. The Alberta Commission displayed a really strong commitment to voter equality. All of the proposed districts in the province are within 5%, which was a really welcome development. And because of population growth concentrated in the biggest cities in Alberta, Calgary and Edmonton have 50%, more than 50% of the province's population, and 17 out of the 34 districts. So the Commission added 1 new district in northern Alberta, 2 in Edmonton, 2 in Calgary, and 1 in southern Alberta, which was a fairly it was a very accurate way of tracking population growth. We think that's a pretty fair result. Now, the Quebec proposal is a little bit disappointing, where we think there should have been a stronger commitment to voter equality. 20 seats deviate by more than 5%, 3 by more than 10, and then 1 by more than 15. Montreal gained the new seats, and then 1 was moved from eastern Quebec to Montreal. So why is a 5 or 10 or 15% deviation problematic? Those are the numbers right now. The new boundaries are going to come into effect, but then they won't be redrawn for another 10 years after that. So if you start off with 15% deviation now, that's only going to increase. We don't know if it's going to be 25 or 30 or 40% down the road, but the numbers can be quite large over 10 years as urban and suburban populations grow, and rural populations tend not to, or they grow at a much slower pace. So the Ontario Commission has not yet released its proposed maps. This would be an important province to look at because with the 15 new seats, the Commission's maps could go in a lot of different directions. Where can we expect to see those 15 new seats distributed? It'll mostly be around the GTA, some perhaps in Hamilton and the Ottawa regions, but the 905 suburban area will be the main place for those ridings. So part of the purpose of this presentation is to encourage all of you to get involved in the boundary hearings, public hearings that are going to take place. So why should you do that if you're someone who believes in voter equality? Well, 75% of the proposed ridings in Ontario, for example, were changed after the public hearings when they occurred 10 years ago. So that's actually quite a dramatic number. So if you are willing to go and speak at these boundary commission hearings, you're quite likely to have an impact on the proposed map. So if you've actually taken the opportunity to look at the maps produced by the commissions that are out right now, you might say, I actually think this map is pretty good. I think they've done a good job. Why should I still bother to go and present? And I think the answer to that is these are proposed maps. We don't know that they're going to stay that way. That 75% number actually indicates they're probably not going to stay the same. And one of the things we actually see is that boundary commissions come under very, very significant pressure at public hearings to accommodate smaller communities of interest and those areas of a province that are likely to lose representation or have less representation. And this often happens because people in those areas are well organized and they come and they present, whereas those on the voter equality side have traditionally been less organized and less present at these hearings. So if you think voter equality is an important Canadian value, as we do, then we would encourage you to register so that you are able to present at a public hearing in your province. So there's a few different options that you have. One is to present at the public hearing in person. The other is to prepare a written submission, which will be considered by the Commission, or to do both. So we've set up a website, voterequality.ca, which lays out a lot of information for the types of proposals you could put to the Commission. And there's an organization called Public Interest, which is available to help you develop a presentation. So the first step that you have to do in order to present or to give a written submission is to notify the Commission that you'd like to do so. There actually are some tight deadlines for that, which is one of the reasons we wanted to do this webinar early in August. So if you live in Alberta and you're interested in presenting, August 10th is the day to keep in mind. You need to register by August 10th. In BC, it's August 30th, and in Quebec, August 27th. And you see on the slide there's other dates. So once the commissions that haven't produced draft proposals come out with theirs, then there will be new dates to register to speak in front of those commissions. So the easiest way to register, it's actually quite simple. There's something called the Public Hearings Notice Form, which is posted for each province on the Federal Electoral Boundary Commission website. So you see that listed below in the slide, federal-redistribution.ca. So if you are interested in presenting, we do really encourage you to do so and offer a lot of support for how to draft your presentations. Then this is the first step, is to register on that website. And then we've got some information on, if you need any further information, the experts who you can speak to, Matthew and I, and Suji Chaudhry. And then the email info for public interest is there below.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Mike. Mike, I'm getting a little mixed up here, for the presentation. I think we're all getting this is a once-in-a-10-year opportunity, and it is important to participate because, as Mike pointed out, this is one of those consultations when your voice can carry weight, and we certainly want to encourage everyone to have their say, whichever way they believe. I'm also very encouraged to see the vibrant conversation online, so perhaps I'll kick off the first question. I would encourage everyone to think about the questions because we have the two experts here to help us answer those. But I think the chat thread sort of indicated an interest in the audience. Why do residents matter? Because not all residents vote. There's been a thread here that babies don't vote. So does the size of a riding, why should the size of a riding depend on numbers of residents as opposed to numbers of voters?
Well, so if you actually look at the numbers, whether you calculate by voters or by total population, suburban ridings and new Canadians are underrepresented either way. So whichever way you want to calculate that. Canada's commissions do actually use total population. Some countries use voters. Total population is quite a reasonable way to approach this because MPs are supposed to represent every single person in their riding, not just those who are actually eligible to vote. And if you are, say, a downtown MP in a large city, a lot of your work is going to be on people who are actually not citizens, they're immigrants, they're new Canadians. So total population is just the way it's done in Canada, but there's actually a reasonable basis for that based on the work that MPs do.
Good. Thank you. We have a question from Voter Equality 9. And the question is, what are your feelings on extraordinary changes? For example, in Newfoundland and Labrador, vastly lower population than the average of the Great White North. Comments, answers, Matthew.
Well, so different people have different views. My view is Canada is a complex country that requires balance and compromise regularly. So much of our population is concentrated now in 4 or 5 urban areas. That I personally think it's acceptable that you do have lower population ridings in some provinces. More importantly, you're not going to ever be able to change that without significant constitutional change. So the seat counts in a place like Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, are protected constitutionally, and they're not going to agree to give up those seats anytime soon. So I think we have to accept some voter inequality. And as I said at the beginning, I think that for representation in Nunavut, for example, or Yukon, these are vast, expansive territories, and having some overrepresentation of Canadians in those communities probably makes sense. What we're more concerned with is the huge deviations between the size of ridings, between two medium-sized towns, or between two suburban districts, or between a downtown Toronto riding and a suburban Toronto riding. I mean, there's no reason in principle or constitutionally where you should have those kinds of huge deviations between the size of ridings. So it's those that we're really focused on, and it's those that I would say the proposed boundary maps that we've seen, particularly in BC and Alberta, are really moving towards voter equality and rep by pop. And so I think it's important for people to come out to the hearings and say, that they support these maps, that they support the move towards voter equality, because it is an important Canadian value.
Can you comment on the provincial situation? Are we better represented provincially? What will the impact of these changes have on provincial boundaries?
You mean in Ontario?
But it's different from province to province. So it's different from province to province. Most provinces have their own provincial boundary commissions that allocate their own seats. And so this process will not have any impact on most provincial electoral boundaries. So in BC and Alberta, they do their own electoral boundary commissions. They have different electoral boundaries. Most provinces have more provincial seats with smaller populations than federally. Ontario, however, is quite unique. Ontario, since the mid-1990s, has mirrored the federal ridings. But there have been changes provincially recently which eliminated something called the Fewer Politicians Act, which decoupled the provincial ridings from the federal ridings moving forward. So right now we don't know actually how Ontario will reallocate seats for a next provincial election. So that's something that I'm sure the provincial government is working on and thinking about.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, as Matthew said, the provincial and the federal boundaries are different, and they have different commissions and processes and legislation that governs it. But at the same time, if you're living in a province and the federal commission is stuck very closely to representation by population, commissions tend to role model with each other. So it's actually very hard then for a provincial commission to say we're going to deviate massively from rep by pop when they're dealing with the same voters in the same province. They may have more ridings, but they're more likely to stick to rep by pop when another commission has shown it's possible in that geographic area.
And I would just add also that many provinces are moving on their provincial boundary commissions and legislation to more strict rep by pop. So Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, depending on the province, they all have rules now in place that say you can't deviate by more than 5% or more than 10%. So provincially, provinces are moving towards greater rep by pop and voter equality.
There are many questions, and there's an urgent question from Mark Coffin who wants us to pay attention to it in case it got lost. Any idea how age demographics factor into electoral representation? Do younger communities have a stronger or weaker vote?
So a couple things. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but let me think about it for a second, and Mike may know. In legislation, boundary commissions are not required to take into account projected population growth. So that's a big issue for some communities like around Calgary and Edmonton or the 905, which are expecting high population growth over the next 10 years. And so we may have voter equality for some of those ridings right now, but two federal elections from now, 9 years from now, those ridings may have gotten quite big, and their populations may have, their vote may be diluted. And a lot of those ridings are going to be younger ridings. The dynamic is that urban ridings, suburban ridings in the 905, Calgary, Edmonton, Lower Mainland. Those have lower average population than the average age in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia or rural Manitoba. There's no doubt about that. I don't know if Mike wants to.
No, that's right. The only thing I would add is that commissions, they have to take into account a variety of factors. No commission, to my knowledge, has ever taken into account age when they're drawing the boundaries.
So there are some comments, and I'm going to try and formulate them into a question. There is another way of dealing with this, which is instead of sending more people to Parliament, that's just contain costs, because every parliamentarian has, carries costs to the taxpayer. And there were proposals, apparently, by Stéphane Dion and Senator Cohen to adjust the ridings by simply adjusting the ridings. What happened to that? What's the political thinking behind going the other way?
So there's, as Matthew said in his part of the presentation, there's constitutional guarantees for the less populous provinces. Those are things that can't be changed without unanimous consent of the provinces, at least the Senate clause. So it's very difficult to change those. So if you have a guaranteed amount of representation for the less populous provinces, you can either accept underrepresentation for voters in the more populous one, or you can add seats to the House. So Stéphane Dion's proposal is an interesting one because it proposed to repeal the grandfather clause, which is one of those protections, which is the one that can be changed by Parliament alone. You don't need unanimous consent, unlike the Senate clause. So I thought that was a good proposal as far as it went. But the problem was this: once you redistribute the grandfather seats, you get relatively close to representation by population now. But then in 10 years, when the boundaries are drawn again, you have no mechanism for adding new seats to keep up with the inevitable population growth in Ontario, Alberta, and BC. So the Dion proposal was fine now, in my opinion, but it didn't actually provide better representation down the road. And if you had a government in 10 years who wasn't interested in representation by population, then voters in those three large provinces would be at a big disadvantage.
And I would also add that I agree with everything Mike said. I think it was an interesting proposal. It was certainly worth considering. But what we're really focused on right now is the new legislation. So Stéphane Dion's proposal was not passed into legislation. C-20 was. And Mike and I may disagree on some of the details, but we think it's a pretty good step forward, and it represents a lot of progress for some of the issues we've been dealing with and focused on. And it's what the legislation is right now. So we're focused on how to make the best of that legislation, which, all things considered, is a pretty good compromise.
There is, thank you, and I'm assuming that it's much easier to add than to take away. So, there's a question about charter challenges and underrepresentation. Has that ever been, as far as you know, Mike, Matthew, have people agitated around this strategy of guaranteeing more voice to underrepresented groups?
I mean, there's a few of us in this room have been talking about it for a while. The problem is that the Supreme Court has a case from 1991. It's the only case that's heard on electoral boundaries since the Charter era. And it said you're allowed to deviate. It's a case about Saskatchewan provincial boundaries, and the court said you're allowed to deviate by quite large numbers. It didn't give an exact number, but it said deviation from representation by population is okay if it leads to more effective representation. Now, the questions are what's effective representation and how much of a deviation is actually acceptable. So it's very hard to launch a challenge under Section 3 of the Charter, the right to vote, because boundaries are not lead to underrepresentation. So because there is an impact on visible minorities, you could argue that this is adverse effects discrimination under Section 15 of the Charter. So there hasn't been a case that's been launched on that basis, but there's been a lot of discussion about whether that's a possibility based on some of the numbers that Sujit and Matthew and I have generated. So that's definitely a possible direction. But a lot of it's up to the Supreme Court, and we're a bit restricted by that early Saskatchewan case.
Thank you. I'm going to urge the participants to help us out by formulating questions. It's a little hard on the laptop to read all of those, and so whilst you're trying to do that, I'm going to ask you a question of comparators to other international jurisdictions. How does Canada fare in this on this issue? Are we similar to the rest of the world in trying to come to terms with large, growing urban populations and the voice of of minorities? Are we completely different?
In general, Canada has been an outlier. Many countries have more clearly enshrined the principle of voter equality and rep by pop in their redistribution processes. There are many problems that go on in the United States electoral redistribution process, and sometimes it gets quite political or partisan. But the fact is, the initial allocation of House of Representative seats is strictly rep by pop, and unlike in Canada, people do lose seats, and states do lose seats in the House. Most large federations have some accommodation for sparsely populated remote areas, but most also are much closer to the principle of voter equality. But what I would add is that many federations have much more effective senates than we have. So the Senate is a way in many places, like in the United States, for example, where each state, regardless of population, gets 2 seats. The same is true in Germany or Australia, where the upper house helps represent the regions. So what we have in Canada is very strong, a lot of deviation from rep by pop in the lower house, in the House of Commons, and in most other federations they have very strict adhesion to rep by pop or voter equality in the lower house, but they compensate a little bit for that by overrepresenting regions in the upper house, in the Senate. And so our House of Commons is a bit of a hybrid, because it does give overrepresentation to places like Newfoundland and Labrador, or New Brunswick, or Saskatchewan, but in some ways that is somewhat more acceptable because our upper house, our Senate, doesn't really fulfill an important democratic function in terms of representing regions very, very well. And I'm not going to talk about the Senate here or have a discussion about that, but it doesn't fulfill the role that it does in other federations.
Although just one example to add to that, the United Kingdom, which their House of Lords equivalent of Senate is not, also failed some tests of democratic legitimacy, and they've got a bill in front of them right now which would have 5% deviations from representation by population, which is quite a bit closer to rep by pop than our 25% that's allowed in the boundary commission. So that's a comparison. That's a comparison that make Canada look very good.
So we have some catching up to do and learning from the world. We have a question about Alberta, which is wonderful, because the Alberta deadline for filing for your spot to be heard is fast approaching. And the question is, I have a question for Alberta. The question is, in the Alberta context, are there examples of when the changes have worked?
I'm not sure I understand that.
Okay.
The recent proposal in Alberta is very close to rep by pop. When we looked at the new draft proposed map, the deviations from the average were very, very small across the board for urban, suburban, rural communities. And so, but I'm not sure what the questioner means.
Okay.
But what I would say is, if the questioner likes the principle of rep by pop and voter equality, it certainly may be useful to present or to participate in those hearing processes, and I would say compliment the Boundary Commission there. I think they've done a good job. Sometimes we only turn out to participate when we have complaints, but I think it's also useful if a Boundary Commission or anyone does something that we support to turn out and support that as well.
And if you speak to Boundary Commissioners, they'll often say, well, we came out with this draft map with the proposal for this region. We were sticking quite close to voter equality, and then we had 10 people come and present from that region saying we don't like those boundaries. So they take that to be representative of public opinion in that region, and it may not be. It may just be that those are the 10 people who are very motivated on the one side to move away from rep by pop. So it's actually very important to give the other point of view.
So that's a good segue into a question that must be on people's minds. How should people who are interested in making representations learn more about the issue? What help can they get?
So, I would start with the paper that Suchi Chowdhury and Mike Powell did a number of years ago, and then some of the papers that we've done at the Mowat Centre over the last 3 years. We're working with Public Interest, who is an organization here who is helping people who want to learn more about the issue and perhaps present or at least explore whether they want to make a submission or present to a hearing. And so that would certainly be one place to contact. And the website for Elections Canada for the redistribution process, we put the URL up there, is a pretty good introduction to the process and what's going on. It's not an introduction to the substantive issues, but it's certainly a good introduction to the process and the logistics of the boundary commissions, the maps. So the draft maps for many provinces are up now, so people could go there and look, or look at the voter equality website.
Okay, so just because some people may be curious, who are these electoral boundary commissioners? Who appoints them? What's their competency to do this?
So there's 3 commissioners for each boundary commission, so one commission per province. The commission is chaired by a judge chosen by the Chief Justice of each province. That's a relatively non-part. So chooses another judge. And then the other 2 members are chosen by the Speaker of the House of Commons. So it tends to be lawyers, political scientists, sometimes people who are experts in boundaries because they've done work in municipal areas, and then judges who may not have any previous expertise in hearing boundary cases, but who have legal expertise.
And if you go to the redistribution website, there's a link that says Meet Your Boundary Commissioner. So here, the Redécoupage fédéral redistribution.ca, and you can click on your own province and you can see who those boundary commissioners are. If you scroll through them all, you will find that their diversity is certainly very slim. But they are nonpartisan, independent, and usually take those roles very seriously. And I certainly haven't heard anything to suggest that this has become partisan or anything like that. These are people who take their job seriously and are independent and want to try and draw fair electoral maps.
Here's a question. What is the name of the 1991 Supreme Court case that Mike referred to?
Reference Provincial Electoral Boundaries, Saskatchewan.
Okay, good.
Often referred to as the Saskatchewan Boundaries case?
Or the Carter case, sometimes people call it.
Carter case. We're coming to the end of our webinar, and people are still madly arguing with each other, which I think is good. If you were to leave the audience with 3 takeaways each, what would they be?
Well, let me start with actually the Carter case, and this just before I come up with my 3 takeaways. I think many people, Mike may be one of them, would say that that case might be ripe for challenge again, and there are many people who think that this. Mike can't say this because he's a lawyer and has to be respectful. That wasn't the court's best hour, and I'm not sure it's the best decision that's ever been written. So the 3 takeaways for me, first would be that if you were in a province like BC and Alberta and soon Ontario, and draft maps have been released, and you generally think that voter equality is an important principle and that these maps move us closer to that, I would encourage you to turn out or to make a submission and say so. Say that voter equality matters, that Rep by Pop matters, that this is an important foundation. It's not a particularly sexy issue, but it's an important foundation for what will get debated in Parliament over the next 10 years, who will form government, how much power individual Canadians will have. And I personally, I don't live in a suburban riding in the 905 or in outside of Calgary, but I think it's a problem for our democracy if those voters have much less power and less influence on what gets debated. I think it affects the tenor of debate from public transit to immigration to criminal justice to, I mean, you name the issue. Different Canadians have different views, and if some Canadians' views are reflected more strongly than others, that's going to shape the debate. So I think moving towards rep by pop and voter equality and saying that it's important can help set a foundation for debate over the next 10 years. And I think that's important. And so that would be my, my one takeaway, and I'll leave it at that, actually.
That's quite a long takeaway, but it's a good one. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try my hand at three. The first is doing a presentation is worth it. The boundary commissioners take it seriously, as the research shows, and I was invited by Elections Canada to do some presentations on some of the legal issues around boundaries to all the boundary commissioners after they got appointed, and they're quite, they're very open to public opinion. They want to know what people have to say. This is a challenge for them to make fair boundaries, and they want to do the best they can. So your presentation really can make a difference. The second point is that greater adherence to representation by population. As Matthew said, it's a bit of a nerdy issue, but the result is public policy produced by the government that is more in accordance with what people actually want and the actual voters in the country. And the third is now is the time to do this because we're at the proposal stage. Once the boundaries are in place, we only have we have to wait till the next 10-year cycle to start talking about reform. So now is the time to get involved. So those are my three takeaways.
So I'm going to close by thanking Matthew and thanking Mike for bringing this somewhat nerdy issue to what I can rapidly see as an excited, there are a bunch of people who are saying, I'm going to sign up, and that's terrific. To the audience, I would say, get the message out that the time is now. If you're interested in voice, you can have an opinion this way or that way, but being heard in and of itself is an exercise of your civic duty. And I want to thank Melissa of Mowat and Alejandra and Vivian at Maytree for helping us put this together. This will be captured forever on Mowat's website, and you can go back to it. You can email Matthew or Mike. We will provide you with their emails. Oh, they're not looking worried right now, so that's good. And we hope to hear that many of you will be participating in those hearings. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.